Is it worth building a Vortec headed 383 stroker? Let's talk about it. In today's video, I'm going to talk about my Vortec headed 383 stroker and should you build one too. Alright, so a little backstory about my 383. Last year I bought this engine. It was in a roller truck that had been sitting since 2006. As of 2005 or 2006, it was a fresh built engine with 0 miles on it. The truck was 90% finished, but they just basically pulled it out into the yard and been sitting and started rusting away over the last 16, 17 years. And I picked it up for a decent deal, pulled the engine, sold the truck, sold the wheels, sold the transmission. So I wound up breaking even. So I have this really cool engine that all I basically had to do was pull the intake and valve covers, check over everything real quick, clean it up, paint it, and throw it in. First my Camaro, now in my truck. So now the truck. It's a 1979 GMC Sierra with factory 308 gears, a turbo 400, and a GM 2500 stall converter. So it's a pretty mild setup. It's got the engine has 062 Vortec heads, and it's got a fairly mild cam and an RPM air gap intake for Vortec style heads. And the cam, I estimate it to be around 220 duration, but I can't know for sure. It has a little chop, but nothing crazy. And I'm going to be comparing it to vehicles I've had the privilege of riding in, and also to my previous setup in the truck. I had a 355 that I still own with a set of AFR Enforcer heads, and it has a XR 282 cam, so a pretty decent sized cam, and a Performer EPS intake. And I ran that engine in this truck with I think it was like a 4,000 stall or something, because it was a straight up hot rod engine and it was fun. So I'm going to be directly comparing the 383 to that engine. The AFR Enforcers on the 355, they flow a little better than Vortec heads, but not much better. By the way, mine are unported stock 062 heads. I'm also going to be comparing my 383 stroker to a buddy of mine's cars. I'm privileged to have a buddy that has two old cars with Vortec headed 350s. One of them is a 1982 Cutlass, which I have a video on. It's just a stock Vortec 350, or excuse me, Vortec headed 350 stock dish pistons, and it's got just a mild, I think it's a 221 cam. Not sure the LSA, I think it's 114, but don't quote me. He's also got a 1974 Corvette, and the Corvette has a Vortec headed 350 as well, with a 231, 237 cam, I believe. So it's a little sizable. So those are the cars I'm comparing my truck to. They both have highway gears. The Cutlass has 241 gears, the Corvette has 273, so my truck has about 600 pounds on them. I know all this is probably a mouthful and an earful, so hopefully you were able to understand everything I was just saying. But I was just trying to set up the scene to compare this Vortec headed 383. And let me tell you something. This engine has surprised me in how torquey it is in the mid-range. All of those burnouts I was doing early on in the video, none of them were holding the brake. The first one that you saw, I held the brake just to get it to about 1,200 RPMs on the stall and then let off and then floored it, but I wasn't holding the brake while I floored it, if that makes sense. So everything you saw was just its own power with a 308 rear end. It's fun and it's torquey. Now the Cutlass with the 241 gears, it's a fun car to ride in, sounds really good, but honestly, it pales in comparison to that 383 that's in my truck. Night and day difference between the two. Now, there is a big gear ratio difference, but we're still all talking about 3-speed automatics with a 248 or 252 first gear. So with highway gears and that transmission, you've got a really long first gear. The Cutlass is fun, but that 383 in the truck is a monster compared to it. And I think the cam sizes are pretty similar. So the main difference is the little bit higher compression ratio of that 383 and the extra cubic inches. And it's a crazy difference. The Corvette, it's a lot closer to a match. In fact, it would probably be dead even with the truck. It might even beat it. We haven't raced or anything, but it pulls good, pulls hard, but still that low RPM torque that this has is monstrous compared to the other Vortec setups I've been in. Now I'm going to compare my 383 to my old 355 setup in the square body. The only difference between the two setups besides the engine was the stall converter. The stall with the 383 stalls about 1,000 RPMs less than the 355s does, so not a huge difference. But with the bigger cam that was in the 355, the bigger stall definitely helped. So comparing the two, the AFR headed 355 had a bigger cam, so obviously it's going to rev higher. I've gotten that engine to 6,500 before, and it never felt like it leveled off. Never felt like it fell off. It leveled off, of course, but it wasn't like just a massive fall off at 6,500. So it was a good revving engine. The 383, so far I haven't revved it past 5,500, but it's noticeably less powerful than the 355 once you get past 5,000 RPMs. But a lot of that's probably just the cam and a little bit better flow with the AFR heads. But where there is a really noticeable difference is with the mid-range torque. I could never scald the tires like I can with the 383 with the 355. Don't get me wrong, it would spin them, and it would spin them good, and you could spin them forever. You know, open diff with 308s, of course you can. But this 383, it's just different. Doesn't take the same effort. You can just be rolling down, 20, 25 miles an hour and step on it in first. Keep in mind, this is a 248 first gear and 308 rear end. So, the gear ratio is pretty long for first. You can just step on it and you can just be spinning all the way up through second. Ton of fun. So between the two, the 383 is a whole lot more streetable in the truck than the 355 was. Overall, the 355 was probably more fun just because you could rev it out and it made a ton of noise, chopped real hard. But the 383, just driving it places, so much nicer. The torque, so much better. It's so much easier, just light throttling everywhere, and it pulls hard. On the highway, you can step on it and pass with no trouble. And I've got a lot milder mufflers on it too, so it's not making a big racket around the neighborhood. I can start that sucker up and drive it to work in the morning. So all this is to say, a ton of numbers. I feel like I've just been jumbling numbers like crazy, so hopefully this video isn't as confusing as all get out. But 383 stroker, very impressive. If you could find a deal on one, or maybe find some cheap Vortec heads, or have a 383 laying around or something, throw those heads on it, put a mild cam or a bigger cam than this if you want. Ton of fun, tons of torque. I have no dyno numbers, but I've personally ridden in all of these cars within the last several months. 355, it's been 6 months or so since I've driven it, but I had it in my Camaro after this truck, so I still know what it's like to drive it. But guys, get yourself a Vortec headed 383. Maybe you'll be as lucky as me and come across a great deal. Good engine. Build one.